The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm your host, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my panel, Dr. Scott Gershwer and Dr. Mark Bound. Today, our panel members will once again be answering questions. We have Paul from Sacramento, California, and Paul says, there are a lot of plans to influence the election through the election boards in certain states. Question 1. Can the Congress certify the valid election if the states have issues certifying? Point 2, why isn't the Supreme Court of the United States getting involved in the process? And part 3, would this create a constitutional crisis? Do you think it will?
Good question.
Yeah, very
Sharp
good question.
audience.
I'm going to kind of go backwards a little bit. Would it constitute a constitutional crisis? Yes. I truly believe it does. I think we have to remember that the founding fathers, as brilliant as they weren't Nostradamus. They couldn't tell what the future was going to hold. I'm sure they could never have imagined that a 34-time felon could actually run for the presidency. I think the closest they ever probably came to that situation was probably Aaron Burr. It's unthinkable, and it would probably be unthinkable to them. So, yeah, I think it would create a constitutional crisis. Why has not the Supreme Court gotten involved? I don't think it's gotten to their level yet. I think that, a lot of this is being dealt with. I mean, there's a process. You don't just automatically jump to the Supreme Court. You've got a process. You've got federal courts, you've got state courts, you've got all that, the system that you have to go through, unfortunately, because it would be nice. Now, there are some instances where it goes straight to the Supreme Court, but that's very rare and far and few between. So I do not believe that it's gotten to that point quite yet. It is disturbing, some of the moves, Georgia, some of the moves that are being taken as far as attempting to influence the results of the election. I think somebody was saying that in Georgia, all ballots must be hand counted and they have to be done in one day. Good luck with that. What do you do with those ones that you didn't count in a day? Are they disqualified? So how many people are you going to disenfranchise? And elections are not supposed to be disenfranchising. This is one of those cases where we need to have really good election reform. We've already talked quite a bit about immigration reform. We need election reform. Why we still have a country of over 300 million people vote on one day, on a Tuesday, during a work week is beyond me. I mean, is absolutely beyond me. And, people have this unrealistic expectation. They did in 2020 when they were standing outside of one place, and I think it was Arizona, yelling, "Stop the count." And in another place they were yelling, and I think it was Michigan, "Count the votes," because you can't have it both ways, guys. So yeah, there's a lot of need for election reform, and I think that would mitigate a lot of these kinds of laws being passed by some of these state legislatures that really are attempting to disenfranchise. And they always say, well, it's for election security, well, it's for this, well, it's for that. And pretty much everybody says, yeah, if you've got 150 million people voting, are you going to have a few that are going to, some election fraud? Of course, absolutely. The numbers are just going to be there. But the question is, does it impact the election at all? And the answer is no, not at all. Just like there weren't 5,000 dead people that voted in Georgia in 2020. So I think that if we had some election reform where it was conducted over 3 days, how about a weekend? Gee, what a great idea, where it makes the process more accessible to more people, more convenient, and gives the state an opportunity to start counting votes, gives them that 3 days, and doesn't have people looking at 12 midnight saying, well, who won? Well, we're still counting in Philadelphia. Well, we're still counting in Atlanta, in these big cities, uh, because you just can't do it. And if you got to do it hand count paper ballots, as they're saying in Georgia, that's going to make it even worse. We might not hear from Georgia for 10 days, a week, more. So I think election reform in this case, and if there is not a good case for it, it's been the last few elections that we've had where we have some election reform and get rid of that damn electoral college, which is so archaic, it's not even funny. Uh, get rid of that and have some true election reform that addresses society today, not society 200 years ago. And I just think that it's. I understand the Republicans don't want to do that because the more people vote, the less chance Republicans have of winning. That's historically the way it is. I understand. Well, my comment to the Republicans are stop putting up people like Mark, you know, that guy in North Carolina that's running for governor. Stop putting up Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. Stop putting up these crazy candidates. And how about coming up with a non-crazy platform like you kind of used to have? There's your answer. You did fine. And I know Scott's not a fan of Reagan. I mean, I'm not totally a fan of Reagan, although I grew up with him. It wasn't any of this crazy stuff. I mean, it truly wasn't this crazy. Even Nixon wasn't. Think about this. Nixon sounds sane at this point in time. That if that doesn't scare you, I don't know what does.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but although
I'm talking in relative terms, Scott.
Although I will say that yesterday, Trump was speaking in Georgia of all places and said that you can't have, what was the quote exactly? You can't have beautiful factories with people walking down the street with all these terrible weapons. And I think what he meant was he wants to ban assault rifles. I can't figure out what else he's talking about. As you know, he's a little unclear sometimes. But if that's the case, and I guess we'll know if the Democrats seize on it and put it out there that Trump is coming out again for an assault weapon ban. I don't think it helps Trump, but I do think it helps erode his support in the right wing of the Republican Party a little bit more. But I'm not really sure what that's all about. I do find that Trump is, one of the things about Nixon was that he had all these great ideas about how to divide the country. Right? Abortion being one of them. I mean, the Republican platform on abortion in the late 1960s, early 1970s was that it was, it was up to a woman. And that was really all they had to say about it. But Nixon wanted to divide and conquer the country, and what he felt he could do with abortion was unite Catholics in the Northeast, who were Kennedy supporters and hated by him, and Baptists down south. And the abortion was that issue. And so that's why the Republican Party has gotten where we are now. This election, which is way too close, and the fact that there is still a Mark Robinson, running for governor. He's been abandoned by the party, but he's still on the ballot. And who knows? He could win. He's losing by quite a bit, but you never know. This election seems to come down to a ground game, like who's better at getting their vote out, who's going to actually pick up people and bring them to the polling place. And then what happens after that? And as you point out, it seems that Georgia and certainly Pennsylvania are going out of their way to draw this out for a longer period of time, I'll say, with the hope that they can create enough chaos so that there's questions about who actually is winning the election. And again, my hope is that Harris wins by so much that it's not a contest and it can't be contested. But that's unlikely to happen. And so what it's going to end up with is, can they somehow get the vote out of the hands of the voters and to Republicans in Congress? And that seems to be what Trump is hanging his hat on in the campaign. He's not doing the things that normal people who campaign do. He has squandered millions and millions of dollars from the RNC that would ordinarily go out to get out the vote efforts, claiming instead that he's counting on PACs to do that work rather than the Republican Party itself. I can't see that being a winning strategy. He's campaigning in bizarre places. He campaigned in New York this week. For what possible reason? Just to feed his ego? Just to make himself feel better? Just because it's a short trip? Whatever his motivation was, I have absolutely no idea. But electorally, it makes no sense. He's not winning New York. It really does seem like their plan is to just create chaos, hope that the Republicans once again rise up in Congress and refuse to certify the vote, which we'll know more about probably in mid-December, I think it is, and then later on in January 6th, after the next Congress is already sworn in, right? And that's what he's hoping for. And I think the rest of the country, for the sake of unity, has to really hope that Kamala Harris could get, as I've said before, 100 million votes and will win overwhelmingly, like win states that ordinarily you would think she would not be winning, like Florida, for example, or North Carolina, that somehow she can make a comeback in Georgia and Arizona and make Nevada. And hold Pennsylvania and hold, Wisconsin, Michigan. I don't think it's necessarily the election boards that are going to be the problem ultimately, because I think the courts will stop them from doing what they want to, what they're hoping to do. And again, we've seen like the Nebraska thing this week where they waited until Maine was no longer able to change their voting rules. And then they tried to change Nebraska's voting rules. But one Republican who used to be a Democrat, now a Republican, is holding out. And the governor yesterday announced that he's not calling a special session in so that they can change the way they vote in Nebraska. That was like a close call. Because that vote might matter. That electoral vote might matter. And as Mark said earlier, this is my final thought on this, is that it would be wonderful to get rid of the Electoral College. It is a relic, and it is a relic of not our best time as America, far from great, and that we really need to move past it, but I don't see it happening because there's plenty of small states out there that won't ratify it and need that electoral college for their own purposes. That's it.
Yep.
So just a question that I have: if we wind up with Georgia, for example, or a state like that has an argument or says it has an argument with counting, and they have discrepancies, and the machine says one thing and a hand count says something else, and they want more hand counts and recounts, and the state can't certify by December 11th or whatever the cutoff date is, and then there are legal challenges or whatever it may be. And at what point has the country gotten to its final deadline where, like in Florida, the Supreme Court might need to be called in, or Congress or so that Trump gets what he wants. And regardless of whether Vice President Harris has actually won the state, count is stopped or never rectified. And let's say Georgia is the winning state for Trump or whatever. In any event, we wind up with, is that possible? Am I making sense?
I think so. I think so. The if the question is, like what's the timeline, right? We know that from the last election, it took from Tuesday to Saturday for the election results to come in. So that's too long, right? But that was, I think it was Pennsylvania, I believe, has a law where they can't start counting their early voting until after election day or on election day. They got so many last time that they had to count. It's a laborious process. They have to open the envelope, verify the signatures, open the second envelope, take out the ballot, count it, and it's it's a time-consuming process, and they're doing it again, right? So we're not going to know who won Pennsylvania on election night, and so that's a week, right? It's no longer election day now; it's election week. You can vote before then, but your vote, depending on what state you're in, your vote may not be counted until after then. And then the next big thing that happens, is in mid-December. I forget what the date is exactly, the 12th or the 15th or something like that, middle of the month. Every state gets together, certifies their electoral count, and prepares to send it over to Washington, D.C. And then on January 6th, the Congress gets together, a joint session. Usually they do hear some objections to it. It used to be sort of I guess you would almost say a pro forma thing. People object, they answer the objection. Okay, at least I objected to it. I got shot down, but at least I did it, and I'm sitting down. Just go ahead and do your thing. And on January 6th, they finally certify the Electoral College's count. They have those little mahogany boxes that everything is kept in. It's a weird ceremony, but nobody used to pay attention to it, but everybody will be paying attention to it this year. And then hopefully nothing bad happens, that causes any concerns as far as insurrection acts and things like that are concerned, right? Because that was another sort of strategy that was going on in 2020. 2021 was we're going to create chaos in the country to the point where we can declare an insurrection and take over municipalities, take over Washington, D.C., take over Congress, maybe pull a Reichstag fire type coup but he's not the president anymore, so he can't stay in office. So that plan won't work. But I think the great hope, as I said earlier, was that they can somehow get it to Congress where every state gets a vote, and there are 26 red states and 24 blue states or something like that, and they install Trump as president. It goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, yeah, well, that's the way the system works, and that's what happens. And that's what Trump seems to be hoping for, but with much chaos,
right?
And potential violence.
Yes, yeah, and I noted Mr. Trump saying, I'm not going to run again in 2028, and I don't remember if it's MSNBC said, oh well, at least he's we'll see if this statement is true later on or in 4 years or whatever, but at least he said he's not going to run again. And if he's telling the truth, then after this time, he'll go away. And I thought to myself, well, that's my interpretation of what he said, is to rouse his voters and potential voters still further, saying, well, this is your last chance to install me. And saying the way he did to people in at the rally in Long Island, vote for me, what do you have to lose? And well, if he's not going to run again in 2028, what people who do want to see him in office have to lose is Trump himself, because he is gone. And he's a limited one-time item now. And so I looked upon that as sort of a he's making himself sort of a priceless commodity. He's not saying, well, I'll just run again, so then there's another chance. This will be the one-time opportunity, so you better vote for me. But I am concerned that even if he is not voted for in the popular vote, that will wind up with some sort of certifying Scott, like you just said. And I am very, very concerned about that. I mean, how realistic do you think that is?
Well, all right. So I mean, let's look at a few facts here. Each state has its requirement of how quickly it must certify in a federal election. There are a group of states that have to do it within 3 days. Places like Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, where Scott's at, Wyoming, South Dakota. Others have 8 to 14 days. Surprisingly enough, Texas and Florida, 2 very large states, are required, and Pennsylvania, within 14 days. They've got to have those elections certified. Then we go to 15 to 31 days. And states like Washington State, states like Oregon, Arizona, Illinois, Ohio, Nebraska, they're all, and a few more, are given up to 31 days. We do have 4 states, believe it or not, that have to certify, that have from 33 plus days. California, which makes sense because they're huge. Colorado, maybe not so much, but I mean, I get it. New York, because again, you've got the city. And here's the big surprise: West Virginia, they get 34 plus days. So that's how quickly the states, by their own legislatures, require them to get the election results done. The electoral votes must arrive at the Congress, must show up to the archives by December 25th, or what it really says is no later than the 4th Wednesday in December. So in this case, it is December 25th. If they don't show up, it is very possible that their electoral votes are lost. So instead of the race for 270, it may be a race for a different number, because you're looking for an advantage, a majority in the Electoral College. On January 3rd, the archivist transfers their certificates to Congress. And then, of course, Congress counts them on the 6th of January. So, I mean, there's a process there. So if I'm a state and I don't get my election counted by what my state legislature says I have to, now that's going to go to state courts, and there's going to be arguments and things like that. If I'm a state, I've got my results, or I don't have my results, and that's still being battled out, and I'm supposed to have this stuff to the federal government by the 25th of December, and I don't. Once again, now it's going to be federal courts, and it's going to be Supreme Court, and all those people are going to start getting involved. So again, there's a process there that kind of gives you some hope. And it's never happened, so it's awful difficult to say where this would go. But it's very possible that they say, okay, Florida, you didn't get your stuff in time. You showed up on the 28th of December. Your electoral votes don't count. Depends on which state we're talking about. If it's a state that Trump won, hurts him. If it's California, hurts Harris. But it still reduces that number of electoral college votes that you need to become the president. So this is one of those things you got to wait back and see. hopefully it'll go smoothly. We won't have to worry about it.
So does this, what the scenario you just described and what we're talking about, does that constitute a constitutional crisis? I'm just curious what a constitutional crisis actually, the definition is, now that we're
I'm
thinking about it.
I think it's any crisis that involves the Constitution.
I totally agree. And it's anything that the Constitution has never had to deal with before.
Yeah, that seems to be right. If nobody actually went and made it a law against it, it's fair game, I guess. We've never had that before, but that seems to be the strategy of Trump.
I mean, that's what it comes down to. The Constitution was written, 200 plus years ago. These people did not foresee the issues that would come. They did put a provision in there so we could have amendments. But the fact is that for some of these things, the law is pretty solid. I mean, these dates are pretty solid. And I don't think we've ever really had anybody, push this issue. So, yeah, that to me is a constitutional crisis because the Constitution doesn't address it. And there's a lot of things that the Constitution simply does not address, especially what's going on in the United States here in the 21st century.
Okay, so thank you both. And thank you to Paul in Sacramento, California, for your questions. Thank you, and thank you both, as always. And we'll see you again next time on the Nova Society.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, the Phoenix Research Group, an independent research consortium offering social issue solutions to NGOs and international government agencies through multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, and unbiased research. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Podkite, who does all our analytics, iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source of music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.